Yeah, I think so.
I think he's...
Yeah, I think so. You'd never be able to hear me if I didn't have it.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming out today. I'm Duncan Seaman, music correspondent for the Yorkshire Post, and this is, of course, Paul Hanley, who played drums for the Fall, whereas what's commonly, I suppose, commonly regarded as the classic lineup.
Well, that's what I like. I'm not sure the Fall's got a classic lineup. Well, it has. It's got maybe 4 classic lineup, 3?
Yeah.
It's certainly got more than one.
Yes. More recently, Paul undertook a degree in English literature, didn't you? And you've written 3 books, the latest of which is 16 Again, that wonderful tone, about Manchester's, well, one of Manchester's finest bands, Buzzcocks. Today, Paul also drums in, is one of the 2 drummers in House of All, which we should mention, a collective of former members of the Fall, who also released your second album, Continuum, last month, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah. Paul, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you said that the kind of original impetus for writing a book about Pete Shelley and Buzzcocks was the shortage of books on that very subject, and that you began writing it as a straight biography. How did it morph into this more personal account of your relationship with the band?
Well, as you say, that was me. I did an event with in Lee at the Turnpike Centre, which is now there's now like a Pete Shelley bench and a fantastic mural. So they're doing their best to try and commemorate Pete, and there's a blue plaque on his house, and there was an exhibition of Malcolm Garrett's work, and it struck me that looking at it, there's only 3 books. And none of which, well, I mean, there's a biography of the band, the complete history of Buzzcocks. There's no biography of Pete Shelley, which I thought was, my thing was, I was thinking, Johnny Rotten's got 2 autobiographies,
Yes.
for a good or ill, and then there's Redemption Song of George Strummer, which is clearly an impressive tome, and I thought there should be a book like that about Pete Shelley, and obviously that would tell the story of Buzzcocks as well as everything else, but it would be about him. But as I started writing it, I kept having to step back and say, well, no, that's just your opinion. You can't do a biography of a book where half of it's you saying how great they are. That's not the done thing, really. So then but then it occurred to me that was the most interesting bit, really. That it was that kind of love affair that a teenager has with their favourite band as they're bringing records out is the most important thing, I think, about being in a band. And there's a parallel there. There's a film called Love You More. Sorry, my phone's going bonkers. Don't start without me, I think it's going. Let me put it on silent. There you go. So, and it's about a girl and a young lad who buy Love You More the day it comes out, and it's all about their headspace as reflected in the record. So I went into that film and the short story that inspired it in the book. So I just wanted to talk about that, really. That kind of what triggered it is, I'll say how important they were to me. And once you start talking about that, so I know it's opinion, but it doesn't really matter. If you don't agree that Buzzcocks were the greatest band in 1978, and I'm sure there's lots of people who don't, the fact that I thought they were, and I'm writing legitimately about why I thought they were and what they meant to me, then that's kind of universal, I think. I mean, there's people, I've talked about that before, Taylor Swift, there's a lot of young people now who look at Taylor Swift in that kind of way. So Pete Shelley was my Taylor Swift, let's put it that way.
In the introduction, you describe Buzzcocks as part of a holy trinity of Manchester bands, along with the Fall and Joy division that you loved when you were seriously getting into music. Looking at it now, you I think suggested that the latter 2 spoke to your brain, whereas Buzzcocks spoke to your heart. Was it Pete Shelley's ability to sort of get inside a teenage mindset that really connected with you when you were between 14 and 16?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely 100%. Yeah, and not only his ability to do that, but to do it articulately and to do it without condescension, and also to be able, because he was the ripe old age of 21, but 22 when he was bringing out Buzzcocks records, but he could still get to that sort of teenage mindset. And I've said it before, it wasn't condescending, it wasn't Jilted John, it was he could sing authentically and write authentically about that kind of weird place you are when you're an adolescent. And amazingly, he could do that. He did that for years, you know. I mean, he was still pulling songs from pre-punk that he'd written, right up to, you know, like Telephone Operator, and even beyond that. He'd written those songs when he was 17, 16, and he could sing them completely authentically and put himself in that mind space, in that headspace, all his life, really. And I think it was a singular talent that he had that not many other people have, I don't think. I mean, you know, I think that in the end it becomes kind of even more valid than what the other punk bands were singing about, you know. I mean, it stands the test of time in a way that no Elvis, Beatles or the Rolling Stones can't, really, which is a bit unfair, because, you know, you know what they were trying to do with that. I mean, that was quite a brave thing to say, but it was also, on one level, it was quite brave and quite iconoclastic. On the other one, it was absolute drivel, wasn't it? I mean, to say that I'm in a rebellious band and we don't like the Elvis, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones is just stupid. On one level, it's completely stupid, on one level, it's fantastic, isn't it? But whereas he just kind of sidestepped all of that and just said, this is who I am, I can write about who I am, and if you see yourself in that, then you're going to get something out of it.
Yes. I know when we spoke, you talked about that, particularly, he wrote love songs, but they were intelligent love songs that were actually sort of more about his state of mind within a relationship. Are there particular songs that spring to mind as examples of that?
Well, I think, as an example of a love, well, if you look at like things like Love You More, it starts off as this kind of syrupy kind of love song, and then right at the end he kills himself, which is what happened there, you know? And then he could do that all the time. Like, what do I get? There's a rug pull at the end where he's jealous of this person all along, saying, I wish I could be more like you, and then they said the reason I'm not happy is because I don't get you. And it wasn't a love song at any point, it was just a sort of thing about jealousy and saying you've got everything, I've got nothing, and then right at the end he revealed that he was in love with this person all the time. So he was very clever at things like that. And, you know, things like Everybody Happy Nowadays, which sounds like it's a light and breezy song, but it's really quite dark in that it's Brave New World, and once you're made to be happy and everybody's happy, then nobody's really happy. You know? And he could write lyrics that said more when they're sung. I think the best lyrics, I think, don't necessarily stand up when you look at a page and read them. But when they're sung and when they're not poems, you know, they need the music to go with that. And he had a great ability for matching a tune to a lyric to a tune, you know, and which again he did all through his career. But so yes, I think Love You More was a brilliant example of that. I Don't Mind's a brilliant example of that. You know, he's got all these songs and you first listen to them and they sound like that. But he's monumentally unhappy in these songs, and nothing's quite as it should be, and he's dealing with people who don't treat him properly or treat the narrator properly, because it's not really him, is it? It's this person who could be a man or could be a woman or somewhere in between, which was another brilliant ability of his. He didn't, you know, categorise by gender or, you know, sexuality. And so, yeah, I mean, I could give you examples all. We can go through all the albums and I can say why this is a great song of your life. But all of them, let's put it that way.
Yeah. That rejection of gender-based pronouns, Pete was very upfront about his bisexuality in interviews. That must have taken some guts at the time, I think.
I think it did, because he wasn't getting in his limo, you know, he wasn't doing an interview with the enemy and getting his limo and then whisked back to his helipad to go. He was getting on a bus and he was walking through the centre of Manchester at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was a rough place in Manchester. I mean, properly scary place. And, you know, punks were getting beaten up all the time just for, you know, just for having hair gel and straight trousers, you know. So he was as Fran Taylor, who was the roadie for the Buzzcocks, he said what people don't realise about he was completely and utterly, he had no fear at all, Pete Shelley. He just, you know, he said it as it was. He'd stand up to people. He just, this kind of, this is me, and if you don't like it, hard luck, was very refreshing, I think. And it wasn't, the other thing about it is, it wasn't artifice, it wasn't Johnny Rotten's persona, and it wasn't the Clash bouncing up and down, it was just him. He just, you know, he'd come on the stage and that was him, you know. If you talked to Pete Shelley, you know, presumably in the queue at Tesco's, he's the same person as he was on stage at some festival in front of 50,000 people. There was no artifice about him, I don't think, which is it's harder than it sounds. I think that, and it is quite brave, I think, to say, I'm not dressing up, I'm not putting on this persona. This is just me, and by the way, I'm a brilliant artist as well.
Yes. That Buzzcocks working class affability, that obviously was something that you could personally relate to. Did you and your friends once turn up at drummer John Miles' doorstep hoping for a chat?
More than once. I mean, really, and I'll have to, I'm doing an event with him in a few weeks, but we just wanted the badges, really. That was basically it. We thought if we go to his house, he'll have some badges, because we were obsessed with these badges that came out. They were a big part of the appeal of the band, which sounds ridiculous, but it's true. But no, that's being quite flippant. He was obviously one of my role models in life was John Maher, but he lived near the school, which we both went to. We both went to the same school, St Bede's, which is a grammar school in Wally Range, and that wasn't why he lived near it. It was because it was a grammar school. It pulled young Catholic lads from all over Manchester, really, and beyond. The lad in my class came from Chapel Henley Frith every day. It's a long way. We happened to find out that he lived just round the corner. So we used to go ostensibly to get his autograph, but we made sure we didn't take everything, because then they could bring another record, and get him to sign that. And then he said, "Oh, would you like some badges?" And then his big mistake was saying, "Would you like some badges?" the first time we went, because if he hadn't said it, we probably wouldn't have gone back again. But there's a new record out, so we had various places we could go to get these badges. So there was the member's house. We went to Pete Shelley's house once in Gorton as well, and got him out of bed. He didn't have any badges. We never went back. And there was Piccadilly Records in Manchester, which is a shop much like this, a bit smaller than this, but a place where you went to get new records, which should be celebrated more. So we went there, but one of the things about that is we went when Love Bites came out. It was a midweek, so we didn't want to wait till we wouldn't have got there till 4:45 if we'd waited till after school. So we snuck out of school at lunchtime because they'd said they were going to get these badges. We didn't want to wait till home time, so we snuck out of school, which was quite risky because it was quite a strict art school. It was, they tried to model themselves on a public school, which they clearly weren't a public school, but it was all rugby and masters in gowns and all that crap. But we snuck out and we thought we'd got away with it, and then my English teacher came up to me later in the day and said, I saw a lad who looked exactly like you on the 88 bus this afternoon at 1:15. And I was thinking to myself, well, that can't be Paul Hanley, because he wouldn't have snuck out of school. So I thought, what a great bloke, what a fantastic bloke that was. Because he knew what was going on, but he was my English teacher, about the only teacher at that school who I kind of took any, because I ended up doing an English degree, so I took a lot of, he was a great teacher, but all the others were.
The book intersperses quotes from band members that were sourced from past interviews and your own interviews and correspondence with people like Howard Devoto, John Maher, Steve Garvey and Malcolm Garrett, plus numerous of your own observations. Was it quite a long sort of sifting process that you went through?
Yeah, it took a long time to write, actually. And so I kind of approached it like you do, having done a degree. You take your sources and you're trying to build your essay from everything that's been written before, So it was a bit of wading through Rock's back pages, a lot of wading through Rock's back pages, which is quite an expensive thing to do. That it's like 200 quid a year to Rock's back pages, but it was really worth it, because and I got the original review of the Sex Pistols at the Marquee Sport in Edinburgh, so that's printed in full. Because that's the one that Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto were sat in Bolton in the refectory of the college, and they found this review. And if you look, you can find like a facsimile of the page, and it really doesn't leap out to you. It's like, because I don't know if you remember what the Enemy was like in 1976. It was heavy type, like none of the fripperies of big pictures or anything like that. So there's like a Carly Simon review, and then I don't know, the Third Ear Band or something, and then there's this little review of Sex Pistols who were supporting Eddie Knuckles, who he didn't bother reviewing. So this review was like, it starts halfway through the Sex Pistols set, and then says how monumentally important they are. Well, not even that. It sort of takes the piss out of them a bit and says that there's something exciting about them. But he clearly had made no effort at all. This guy, he reviewed the 20 minutes he happened to be in the venue. But part of what he said was they do covers, versions, and they do a Stooges song. So that was it. That was what got them to say, right, all right, one afternoon in Bolton, right, we'll go down to London at the weekend, which I find incredible, really, because even now, I mean, but then going to London it was a fairly big undertaking, I think, getting off your backside and going to London. And so they borrowed a car, well, they had the use of a car, so they didn't have a car, and they stayed in Reading, that place that's famously really handy for London, Reading. And then, the story unfolds. They rang the NME. They rang the NME, which it was shifting some units then. It wasn't like, it wasn't a fanzine. It was like hundreds of thousands. Yeah. And got through to the guy who'd written the review, who then happened to know that, I don't know, he said, I'll know how to contact the Sex Pistols, but I know the manager's got a shop on the King's Road called Sex. But so the fact that they could ring the NME, I wouldn't know how to ring the NME, from a phone box. Yes. And then they got through to the guy who happened to have written the article, who then knew how to find it, or could have found the Sex Pistols. And then they went to Malcolm's shop, and he hadn't shut 10 minutes before, early closing, he wasn't stock taking or gone for a pint or anything. He was in the shop, and he said, oh, well, they're playing tonight, actually. And the chances of that are quite large, because they didn't play for a month after that weekend. So if it had been a week later, they'd have turned up at Malcolm's shop and he said, oh, no chance, mate, sorry, we're not playing. So, but all these kind of stars had to align for that to work, which is kind of incredible, really. So that's obviously another part of the story. See, that's sourced from various interviews. So there's a quote from the guy from Melody Mix said, "Oh, good job they didn't ask me, because there's no way I'd have been out of it." So yes, I looked at a lot of print.
Yes. Although of course he's very much still with us. You avoided speaking to Steve Diggle. Were you concerned, I suppose, that he might sort of become the dominant voice in the book if you did?
Partly, and because he is quite a dominant character. And the other thing is, if I liked him too much, I wouldn't be able to write the way that I wanted to. I didn't want to be coming at it from the point. Well, I can't say that's not very nice about it. I mean, not that I've tried to be unnice to him or anything, or been unfair. I mean, I've tried to be fair all the way through. But I got that from a guy called David Nolan, who's an author, and he's written loads of books. And he always said, you never interview you interview everybody you can around them, but don't interview the person who you're writing the book about. And that kind of the thrust of the book was that it was that relationship between Pete and Steve. So, and I obviously couldn't interview Pete, so I thought it'd be a bit unfair, really, for balance. Like I say, I didn't want to get, and what a great bloke, I can't put that in.
There's an interesting contrast between Pete and Howard's upbringing. They were both grammar school boys, weren't they? Pete in Lee in Lancashire, and Howard over here at Leeds Grammar School, where he met Richard Boone, who went on to manage Buzzcocks. Pete was obsessed with Bolan. Howard loved Bob Dylan, I think. When they met at Bolton Institute of Technology, it was stuff like Stooges, Brian Eno, Velvet Underground that sort of formed a common ground between them. Already the seeds of, I suppose, sort of outsider music were being sown.
I mean, you say that, and it is, they are all outsider music, but they're all Bowie, aren't they? Everybody got through all those acts through Bowie, I mean, everybody got through everything in Bowie. I think that if you look at if there's one thing that links all the punk, or people who became punks, they were all massive Bowie fans. And I think the interesting thing about Stooges was, if you were thinking, I want to start a band, you're not going to look at Life on Mars and say, oh, I could do that. It's not that insane. Oh, we could do that. But when Bowie introduced the Stooges, you went, well, I can definitely do that, because they can barely do that. So if they can do that, I can do that. And which was obviously what the Sex Pistols took from the Stooges, and New York Dolls as well. That kind of endearingly rag-ass kind of music. You think, well, but this guy's not a virtuoso, I could have a go at that. And that, I'm always saying that. I mean, it is again a cliche to look at a band and say, the noise they're making is something that I'm not incapable of, so I'm going to have a go and do it. I mean, I think a lot of people might have thought that, but I think the liberating thing about punk was that you could then have a go at it and do it. You could say it all you like, and you could say I could play that, but then once punk happened, there was places that you could say I could do that. Here's a stage, So I think that was the big thing about punk. I think you didn't need great equipment. You didn't need to have rehearsed for 10 years, and you didn't need to be part of a special elite. You were as much a part of this whole movement as the people who were in the bands already, I think.
After that, seeing that Sex Pistols gig, Pete and Howard brought the Pistols up to Manchester twice, didn't they, to perform at the Lesser Free Trade Hall in 1976. Do you think the appeal to them was, I suppose, that there was rawness about them, and also there was John Lydon's rather confrontational personality?
I think he was a massive part. I think if you look at the Sex Pistols music, it's great, don't get me wrong, but it's not massively original. It's not like, what the hell's this? Whereas I think Johnny Rotten, his persona and his vocal styling were just, what the hell is this? I mean, even Iggy sang, and he could hit the same note twice, whereas Johnny Rotten was, wow. And I think that whole, I think that the rest of the Sex Pistols took that attitude from him. That we're gonna, if you don't like it, well, that's what one of the things John Marr said. What the hell have I, on this first gig? He supported the Sex Pistols, so that was his first gig. He didn't play. The Buzzcocks didn't play the first Sex Pistols gig, so the second one was Buzzcocks for his first time on a stage ever, and he was like, what the hell have I got into here? And they walked in and they were like the most intimidating people in the world, which I think people tend to underestimate just how, you see like them on TV, not the Grundy thing. I mean, that was a bit pathetic in my eyes, but when you see them on So It Goes when they're doing Annick in the UK, they're just like, wow, this is so different from anything else. And they clearly weren't they? Because they clearly ignited something in a lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a serendipitous meeting with Steve Diggle at the first of the Lesser Free Trade Hall shows, I think, and depending on whose account you believe, that Peter Hook, Morrissey, Paul Morley, Marky Smith, Tony Wilson, and possibly even Mick Hucknall, I think, attended one or the other, or the other of the gigs. Would it be fair to say that, I suppose, the whole musical landscape of Manchester over the past 40-odd years would have been very different without those shows?
Well, it's a bit hard to tell, isn't it? Because there was clearly a lot of talented people in that room. So whether that talent was enough that without something that brought them all together, it would have happened anyway. I'm not sure. I'm not so sure it would, to be honest. And one of the things is, I don't think, if you take it through to its logical, it's not just the Manchester music, it's the whole of Manchester was kind of framed by that. But no, I think there's something in, if you look at, it didn't happen quite the same anywhere else. I don't think that whole cultural renaissance didn't happen quite the same in any other. And I think, without being too airy-fairy about it, the fact that there was two of these gigs, that between which the kind of scene coalesced, in that 6 weeks between the first one and the second one, there was something going on by the time the second one went on. So I don't know. It's impossible to speculate whether, I mean, if you look at Barney and Hooky were clearly in two of the best bands I've ever heard. So it would be a bit weird if they'd never picked up a guitar. But who knows? I don't know. If Paul McCartney hadn't gone to that show, and seen John Lennon up there, maybe they'd never have gone anywhere. But you'd like to think that there's enough there that somehow it would have come to the front, but I don't know. I don't think so.
Yes. John Marr was the last piece of the Buzzcocks puzzle. He was only 16, I think, when he was offered a job in the band, and had only been playing drums for about, was it 12 weeks when they supported the Pistols?
Yes, he hadn't been. By the time he got to his first gig, he'd been playing 12 weeks. When Howard Devoto knocked on his door and said, "Do you want to be in our band?" He'd probably only been playing about 8, maybe, and he was signed up sight unseen as well. And he wasn't like he got his drum kit out in the hall and said, "Here, Howard, this is what I can do." Howard just said, "Do you want to be in our band?" On the recommendation of a third party who he'd rung up, who'd never heard him either. So, I mean, that's really odd. So he rang up a girl who saying, "I believe you're a drummer," and she said, "Oh yeah, but I'm not really good enough. You want to have a look at this other lad, John Marr?" She'd never heard him either, so he could have been terrible, couldn't he? But he wasn't. I mean, I described him, but he was absolutely the perfect drummer for Buzzcocks because he was clearly a precocious talent, and he hadn't spent 2 years flogging around the pub rock circuit either, so he wasn't content to do impressions of other people. I mean, our drummers all do impressions of other people, but the cool thing about it, you've got to do impressions of the right drummer, so he was, he picked his influences very carefully, and he was such a brilliant drummer, and such, and it's all, he didn't have drum lessons, so it's all intuitive, and fantastic. And the problem with me is I really got into Buzzcocks on that first album, and I've never really got over his drumming. I've been ripping him off mercilessly for the last 40 years, and shall continue to do so.
Through Linda Sterling, they were introduced to Malcolm Garrett. Do you think that their artistic input was really important in defining a very specific aesthetic for Buzzcocks that set them apart from their contemporaries?
Massively, I think that that whole aesthetic that Malcolm created for them, and the other thing, of course, is it followed through. It wasn't like we got this bloke to design this first record, and then the second one's like this, third one's someone else. It was an aesthetic that carried on through with that Buzzcocks logo, which is an amazing logo, and there was bits of each one that carried on. So there's calls back to the Orgasmatic sleeve on the sleeve of another music, and they kind of all speak to each other. So I think that was really important. It was certainly really important for me. I've described, the design of Buzzcocks is like the fifth member of the band for me, as far as I was concerned. And I latched onto the sleeve before I'd ever heard another music video in the kitchen. Steve brought it home and showed it, and I thought, that's fantastic. And I said this to Malcolm, and the thing about Buzzcocks was, what got me into it was the music was as good as the sleeve, which, I can't give the sleeve any higher recommendation than that. I got into Buzzcocks because the music was as good as the sleeve. The sleeve was like, it's a lovely thing,
Definitely. You suggest in the book that the band's appearance at the 100 Club Punk Special in September '76 was kind of the peak of Buzzcocks Mark I's creativity. Do you think that was where Howard began to realise punk's limitations? That it served its purpose as far as he was concerned, or did that come later on the Anarchy UK?
Well, no, but there's a review of that gig by Caroline Coombe, and she says Howard's already said that his time with the band's limited, so he had it in his head. I mean, part of that was post-rationale, where he wanted to finish his degree, and so he wrote that, this is all old hat now. Whether he really meant it. I mean, magazine were quite different from Buzzcocks. They weren't that different. He didn't say, I've had it with this punk scene, I'm going to start a lounge jazz band or something. They were still clearly in debt to punk, weren't they? But I think he found his own voice when he formed magazine. I think he'd had enough of doing an impression of Johnny Rotten, I think, which you can clearly hear on Spiral Scratch, and even more on the Time's Up record. He's definitely trying to sound like Johnny Rotten and look like Johnny Rotten as well.
Yes. Buzzcocks' final statement with Howard was the Spiral Scratch EP.
That was the first statement as well.
Yeah, I know, it was a bold one as well. It kind of kick-started the whole do-it-yourself scene. Do you think that it was an important signpost that suggested to a lot of other musicians that putting out records was doable if you put your mind to it?
I think, without a doubt, without Spiral Scratch, Rough Trade, Fast, Postcard, a lot of labels took their cue from, and certainly Joy Division. If you look at Joy Division's first EP, it's pretty much a carbon copy of, not musically, but in what it is. It's a 4-track, pressed on a single, paper sleeve that they folded together themselves. They clearly, Joy Division clearly took their cues from Buzzcocks. And more, they took advice from Buzzcocks. But yeah, that was a massive thing, I think, that whole kick-starting. There had been indie things before, and Stiff was ostensibly indie, but they were music industry people then, and they had money as well, which is brilliant. But yeah, I think so. That whole idea, you could put a record out, and you could do it. You didn't need a record company to say, here, you're in this studio tomorrow. Then it's going to be pressed in the next. You do this recording, the next you'll see is when we hand you this piece of plastic in a sleeve. But for a band to say, now, I'll tell you what, we'll book the studio. We'll get the pressing plant, we'll do all that. It was unprecedented then, and it's fairly rare now, I think, that bands will go to the effort of doing that whole process themselves. A lot of the time, you're talking about young people, they to their own disservice, they hand that over to a record company who then, for want of a better phrase, rip them off. Which is how, it's nothing personal, it's just how the music industry works. You're then at their whim, really, aren't you?
Yes. Howard's departure could have easily destabilised Buzzcocks, but the band seemed to take it in their stride. Pete took over as main songwriter. Steve switched to guitar, and Garth Davis joined for a short while on bass before being replaced by Steve Garvey. Do you see that as the point where they, I suppose, sort of started to abandon the strictures of punk, particularly the 4/4 time signature?
Yeah, I think at that point, I think everybody was looking. So, I think Buzzcocks did it earlier than most other bands. At some point you realise you can't stick to that. It's one album, isn't it? That whole punk kind of thing. So you either split up like the Sex Pistols do, or you then explore other avenues like the Clash did, or you make a radical change to the way you write songs, which is what Buzzcocks did. Obviously, once Pete Shelley became the main songwriter, it became a different thing and a better thing for me. I mean, there's no such. I can say it's better. There's only an opinion, but I thought they were a more important act without Howard. Which isn't to denigrate Howard. I thought the first Buzzcocks were great, but I think there was something about that second lineup that was just, well, it's enough to write a book, so you can't really say any more than that, can I?
One of the lovely things about Buzzcocks were they were good at supporting other bands, particularly from Manchester. They took The Fall and Joy Division out on tour with them. Did you see their generosity firsthand?
Yeah, well, I saw my brother played in when Buzzcocks played. I think it was the King's Hall in Bellevue. Fall supported them. With Steve, my brother Steve was on bass. I bought a ticket. I thought I'm not relying on getting on the guest list here, because if something happens, I'm going to miss the gig. I mean, I could live with not seeing The Fall at that point, but I wasn't going to miss Buzzcocks gig. But yeah, you could see it. And the first time Steve toured America, they played with Buzzcocks. Buzzcocks got support, so they were, Buzzcocks always looked out for that kind of scene. And definitely first time, Fall's first EP, Bingo Masters, Buzzcocks paid for that recording. They put them in the studio, and they didn't have a lot of money, and it was a part of Richard's mission. And I think Richard and Pete were the two really were, and Howard to an extent. They wanted to. It wasn't like building a scene. It wasn't like Malcolm McLaren. We'll get other bands because then we'll look like we're really important. They just really thought, well, we've done it. We want to help other people do it, which they did. They put, and it wasn't just Manchester bands either. Penetration. They did Gang of Four. They were on a kind of a mission to bring these bands from various places in the country down to London.
The band did eventually sign to United Artists. Do you think there was an appreciation that I suppose, a practical appreciation that they needed a larger budget behind them to achieve their goals?
I think they needed a larger budget to eat the dinner. I think Shelley was skint. He got booted off the dole because he was on a Granada TV programme, and he went to sign on, and they said, well, you're clearly earning money. I saw you on the telly last Thursday. So they needed some money at that point. They had some money from Sparrow Scratch, but they spent a fair bit of that on hotels and things supporting the Clash on the White Riot tour. So at that point, they didn't have any money. When they did Sparrow Scratch, Pete's dad and mum had to take a loan out to lend him the money for some of the EP. So there was no, thank a mum and dad, or Trustafarians or any of that nonsense. They needed to eat and they needed to live. So at that point, they had to sign to a label, really. It was kind of a shame in one way, but then in other ways, you'd have been deprived of the kind of bigger budget that they had to record and that sound they got on them albums in the Olympic. And the sleeves, as we have noted, sleeves were fairly important, and that needed a bit of budget, I think. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, they had to sign to a label. They couldn't have carried on, I don't think, without doing it.
There's a famous photograph of the band in the studio on the cover of Singles Going Steady. That's very much the setup, I think, that the producer Martin Russian envisaged for them, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, when I saw that sleeve, I thought they've clearly moved everything around it to make it look like they're on stage. And nobody records like that. You don't do it. But apparently, according to John Martin and Martin Russian in an interview, that's how they set up. So he put the drums on a drum riser, and the amps are obviously off to the side and behind baffles and everything, but he could stand like they were playing a gig, And that's I mean, it's genius, really, because your head's in a different space in the studio, it's a different experience. It's quite scary, but to get them to then set up like they were on stage, because they'd done a fair few gigs back then, so they knew what they were doing on stage. So if they could play their first album like they were doing a gig, then I think that's what gave them the freedom. Because the other thing about it is it moved the sound on. So he did it like that, but it doesn't sound like a gig. It sounds like a really, really well-produced album. That so he was brilliant, Martin Rushing. He got them to where they were happy, but not to the point where it cost him fidelity, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So he could have recorded a gig and it would have sounded trite, but his genius was that he could do both. He could make them sound like they were in a really good studio, but comfortable enough that they felt like they were on stage. I mean, it's one of the reasons he's a brilliant producer, isn't he?
Yes. Their debut album, Another Music in a Different Kitchen, was your introduction to them when your brother Steve brought home a copy of it. It isn't your standard punk rock record. They were actually, I think, ahead of Peel in bringing in that German influence of Can and Neu and Kraftwerk.
Yeah. I mean, there's influence. You can hear Bo Diddley in there. You can hear the things that the Clash and the Pistols. But there is another element that, like you say, that Kraftwerk, that kind of European, kind of icy, emotionless kind of things in there as well. And there's a song that's not 4/4, which none of the other punk bands. There's nothing on the Clash's first album that isn't 1, 2, 3, 4, or nothing on the Pistols album. And there's that Music Concrete bit in 16 where there's no time signature at all. And then there's moving away from the Pulse beat, which is. It's got 2 really long guitar solos and a drum solo in the middle, which I don't think the Clash would have gone near in 1977 at all, or the Sex Pistols clearly. But they were clever enough to present it in a way that it didn't look like prog, but I think there was some prog in there. Because, that's one of the nonsense things about this year's era of 1976. I don't think as long as, Pete Shelley was saying, much like the Clash were, everything went before was all twiddly guitar solos, and they didn't believe it. I believed it because I was a bloody idiot, but lots of my generation believed it. We came up after, and all my favourite bands were saying everything that went before was crap. You couldn't buy it anyway, very easily, so it was easy to believe that. So they bloody swindled us, to be honest. But they were obviously Pete was clearly influenced by Can. Massively influenced by Can, and lots of other things. Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. You've got everything you've ever heard will come out on your records eventually, I think. But they were just pretending that everything else before was crap.
Did John Marr's playing on that record then directly encourage you to take up the drums yourself? I thought there was an interesting parallel because you were 16, I think, when you joined the Fall as well.
Yeah.
John was 16 when he played in Buzzcocks.
Well, I got my drum kit in the February of 76, I think, and then was it February? I got it for my birthday. No, it wouldn't have been 76. Whenever it was, the year that Another Music came out, 77. So, and then that came out in the March or the April, I think. So I really had just started playing the drums, and as I've described in the book, my previous experience of playing the drums before I got a drum kit was on the arm of the chair to top of the pops. So when I got a kit, I really didn't know what to do. I can hit this one, but now how do you go? And Steve said, well, there's a band I've seen a few times, and they've got a song where all the drummer hits is the snare all the way through, and it was 16 by Buzzcocks. I mean, it's not true, he does touch other drums, but mainly it is on the snare. So the first thing I ever learnt to play on the drum kit was 16, and I hadn't heard it. It didn't come out on the record for another 2 months. So, it wasn't quite correct what Steve had shown, which was near enough. So yes, I was predestined to be completely influenced by John Marr's drumming, even before I'd heard him. So, and the fact that he went to our school and left at 16, now that's what you do. You get a drum kit, you learn how to play it, you leave school at 16 and you join a band. What else would you ever want to do in life, I think. That's fair play to him.
Yes. Love Bites, the follow-up to Another Music, you make a case, make a case for it being the sort of artistically the most successful second album made by any of the groups from punk's first wave. Pistols didn't even get to make a second LP, and the Clash give them enough room. Yeah. Damned released music for pleasure.
I mean, whatever you can argue about the relative merits of Give Enough for all years on, and I don't think it's great. And there's all the young once you've got bands and they're singing about moaning about how hard it is being in a band, that's the kiss of death, isn't it? You write your first album, you write about your whole life. Your second album, you get 3 weeks to write it, and you end up writing about what it's like in the back of a van on the way to, the Blue Ball Services or something. It's not a healthy way to write an album. Well, I think on that level, Buzzcocks' second album is artistically very successful. The the lyrical stuff's really good. It's got the biggest hit on it for the kick-off. And so it was, and it was 6 months. It was 6 months after the first album. So they clearly weren't hanging about. Probably for ill in the end, because I don't think it's a particularly healthy way to live, to work that hard all the time. And it certainly took its toll on Pete as the main songwriter. And there was a lot of pressure on him to write, and he kind of blew up in the end. He wrote the first 2 albums very successfully, and then when it came to the third album, I think these were songs on there that are just genius from start to finish. But after that, he was completely burnt out. He couldn't write for Buzzcocks anymore because he'd done so much of it so quickly, I think. And that's why I think that's part of the reason Steve Diggle stepped up as a songwriter. Partly through he wanted to do it, and he had a lot of good songs inside him, but it was necessity really. Pete he kind of blown the fuse.
Well, that worked great in 1978. I think it was about 100 gigs, 5 singles, 2 albums. Pete Shelley also contributed to John Cooper Clarke's album, This Guy's in Love. And he formed a side project called Tiller Boys that sort of indulged his fondness for sound collages.
Yeah. It's mad, isn't it?
It's hard to get, it's impossible to maintain.
It's not a healthy way to live, that, is it? You've just done a tour of America and you're doing the UK. Oh, by the way, can you come in for a peel session tomorrow? And then we're going to start working on the next album. But you've got 2 days off. What are you going to do? I'm going to play on John Cooper Clarke's album. You have a bath, watch the telly. But they didn't. None of them did. The Clash were the same. And it's not. It's self-fulfilling, kind of burnt out. The record companies want them to do as much as possible because they don't think it's going to last long, and then they end up not lasting long because the record company asked them to do too much. So it's a vicious circle, which they never learned, did they? No. They never learned. They're still doing it now. The bands now they just work to death, aren't they?
Well, yes, that does. I think. You look at poor old Lewis Capaldi as an example of
course,
that.
At least now people are talking about mental health, and how this particular lifestyle isn't particularly good for it, because that's what did for Pete. It might not come as a shock to you, but people in bands aren't that good at looking after themselves sometimes. They sometimes take substances that probably wouldn't help the mental state as well, which, lots of them are guilty of, and I'm not judging anybody, but they need looking after, and they're not looked after, people in bands, or they certainly weren't then. And, Pete definitely had mental health issues, and I think anybody now would recognise it, but similarly, I suppose, to Ian Curtis, the other 3 lads in your band aren't the people who are best placed to say, listen, you've got real problems here, you need to slow down, get some help, They're going to say, quit getting the band, we've got another gig tomorrow.
Yes. The third album, A Different Kind of Tension, had a conceptual second side. There's even a 7-minute track on there called I Believe.
Yeah.
There's a quote from John Maher in the book about this being the first time that there was a real separation between Pete's stuff and Steve's stuff. Pete later acknowledged that his writing was I think you mentioned, Wagnerian, quite heavy and stern on that record.
Yeah.
With hindsight, do you think that embarking on a US tour straight afterwards was a step too far?
Yeah, he threatened to leave every second day, Pete, on that tour. He was locking himself in the room and saying, I'm not getting here. But then what else was a band then going to do, They brought out the third album, they brought out the singles Going Steady. That was the first thing that came out in America. And, there was an audience there, and there might not be an audience there in 6 months' time. So nobody was saying, well, in the end, after that, it did get to the point where Pete said, I need a year off, And everybody agreed, all right, okay, we'll take a year off. And it lasted about 3 weeks, they were back in the studio. They didn't do a lot of gigs, but I don't think they knew what to do with time off, They didn't know what to do with it. They might have had a few bob for the first time. John Maher was quite good. He got into cars and things. He was quite a healthy mindset, and he's quite a capable guy, John. Whereas I don't think the others they didn't know much what else to do except play music, So, but yeah, it probably would have been right to say we've just done 3 albums and our singles compilations just come out in America. Let's not do an American tour. But it's never going to happen, is it? No one's going to agree to that.
No. Buzzcocks did sort of attempt to make a 4th album with Martin Hannett. It was probably the wrong choice of producer for them, I think.
Dreadful by then, yeah.
Pete was depressed as well, and there was a lot of drugs and alcohol around at the time. Relations were fracturing. It seemed a sort of poignant farewell that their last UK gig would be in Bolton, where they played their first UK show 5 years earlier.
Yeah, well, it depends who you ask. If you ask Steve Diggle, that wasn't a proper Buzzcocks show. He was just Howard and Pete and Garth, who happened to be in the band as well, so and they were called Buzzcocks. So why would you call it a proper Buzzcocks show? But yes, it was. I mean, it seems like forever, doesn't it? But it's no time at all, really, is it? It's what is it? 5 years, maybe? Yeah. I mean, they did all, same with the Clash, same with them all. They did this body of work which we're still talking about now, 40 odd years later, in literally no time at all. And very quickly, Stone Roses took 5 years to make the second album, which is a bit obsessive, but there was an undue haste about it, I think, which I don't think it'd have worked without. I think part of that whole thing was it just, and then it was gone. It's an amazing thing. Same as I say with the Clash, Sex Pistols was even shorter, wasn't it? But there's something to be said that you set up, you do it till you can't do it anymore, and then you stop.
You do take a brief look at Pete's solo career in the book. It's interesting that his enthusiasm for electronic music, which kind of became a sort of signature sound in solo material, that almost predates Buzzcocks.
It does predate Buzzcocks. He did, I think, it eventually came out called Sky Yen, which is basically him with an oscillator and a wet finger, and making all these sounds. It's not, you wouldn't put it on while you were cooking the tea, Sky Yen, but I think interesting is about as high a praise I can get it. It's not songs, and it's not. But it's an interesting thing, and it's really interesting if you think he was doing that before he ever started. He was in Buzzcocks, And then I asked Howard about that. I said, given that Pete was quite into electronics, was it ever discussed that he would use that? And it was not on. There was no way. Punk wasn't about synthesizers. Punk was about a guitar. It was basically the Sex Pistols, wasn't it? It was one guitar, one bass, singer, drummer. That was punk bands. So it is interesting that he had that in his back pocket, I think that one of the things is he was a bit of a boffin, So in being a bit of a boffin and a nerd stopped him being too much of a guitar hero, and in being a guitar hero stopped him being too much of a nerd, which is why he is the